remembered. He remembered his childhood, before the dreams and visions came. He remembered discovering that the voices in his head were not his own, but belonged to the people around him. He remembered Calist and Tezzeret, Baltrice and Gemreth, and of course, Liliana. He remembered pain. He remembered the rape of Calist's mind and the loss of his own. He remembered the day it began, 3 years ago and more. This was Ravnica. Ravnica as she was meant to be. The district of Dravok flowed down the shallow mountainside like an avalanche trapped in amber, bewitching beneath the brilliant sun. Like the peak itself, it stretched down to the banks of the wide and rushing river, even occupying a few of the smaller isles and outcroppings that rose amid the breakwaters. Great buildings of gleaming marble lined the wide byways, their roofs sharply sloped, their eaves adorned by figures both abstract and concrete, angelic and diabolical. Some were only a handful of stories tall, but many more towered impossibly, monolithically into the infinite sky, artificial mountains protruding from the real, or jutting from the deep waters below, casting endless shadows. From broad cupolas and needle-thin spires, a network of bridges spanned the district, a webwork of roadways that never deigned to touch the earth. Towering statues of forgotten gods and heroes stood amid broad plazas or supported heavy walkways on their pseudo-divine shoulders. Some few of the highest towers had no earthly roots at all, but were held aloft by mighty spans of stone, connecting them to other structures with more mundane foundations. Far below ran roads cobbled in stone that never lost its sheen, from the narrowest twisting side streets to avenues so broad that a crossbow shot from one curb could not kill a man standing on the other. One of those grand avenues ran straight down the side of the mountain, terrace to terrace, level to level, providing those at the top a clear and astonishing view all the way down to the river. Along it strode an array of sentience unheard of on other worlds. Humans and elves, goblins and Viashino, loxodons and centaurs, even angels and the occasional ghost rubbed shoulders or scurried from one another's paths. So many words, so many scents, combined into a voice and an ambience greater than the sum of its parts. An atmosphere that was, among all the cities of the multiverse, absolutely unique. This was Ravnica at her richest. But even here, she was slowly dying. Just a tiny bit more every day since the guilds fell. She was beautiful still, but beneath her expert makeup, she was an aged courtesan, growing ever more sickly and infirm. And whether the city would recover from the travails of the past generation to rise once more into something greater, or whether she would collapse under her own weight, even the farthest-sighted oracles would not say. Near the uppermost levels, in the midst of that broad and sloping avenue, Jace Bellerin sat beneath a parasol at an open-air cafe called Heavenly Ambrosius and sipped a glass of cold mint tea. Though his hair was perhaps a few inches longer than the current fashion, and he eschewed a full beard in favor of a clean-shaven jaw, he looked every inch the Ravnican aristocrat. His garb was of the finest cloths and leathers, dyed not in the bright and garish hues of the middle classes, so desperate to show off, but in the somber but much richer colors of the truly affluent. His fine tunic and pants of supple suede were both midnight blue, his vest a black so deep one could almost have fallen into it. But most magnificent was his cloak, a flowing liquid hue that could have been a sliver of the darkest oceanic depths. The buttons and clasps of this vest and cloak, and there were many of them, as befit the current styles, were all of burnished silver, and boasted an array of symbols that looked arcane and mysterious to the uninitiated, but were in fact utterly meaningless. Jace just thought they looked nice. Across from him, drinking something Jace couldn't pronounce, but that certainly packed more of a punch than his own mint tea, was, well, not a friend exactly, but close enough. Rulon was clad much like Jace himself, though he preferred deep reds and purples to Jace's unrelenting blues and black, and unlike Jace, Rulon boasted a full, tidily trimmed beard. A beard that, at the moment, had captured a bit of the foam from Rulon's alcoholic whatever it was. Jace didn't point it out. "Half of what's left," Rulon said, continuing the thought he'd begun before taking a heavy swig. Casually, he passed a small coin purse across the table. Jace lifted it, scowled at its weight, or more accurately, the lack thereof. "Half?" he asked doubtfully. "Really?" "Half," Rulon confirmed, "and that's all the accounts, under all your names, put together." The scowl grew, if anything, darker than the outfit beneath it. Jace took a moment to look out over the wall of the terrace to the glistening waters far, far below. "Maybe you ought to be charging me less of a commission then," he offered. Rulon snickered and took another deep gulp of his drink, a drink that Jace, reluctantly, was paying for. "You find another banker willing to keep accounts in 4 different districts under 4 different names, and see what sort of deal he'll offer you." He belched once more, covering his mouth with the back of a well-manicured hand, and then frowned. "Barim," he said more seriously, for that was the name by which he knew his young client, the name under which Jace did all his business in Dravik. "You know I'm giving you a damned good deal already." "Yeah, I know." "Then I suggest," Rulon said, rising to his feet, "that you consider either a somewhat less extravagant lifestyle or a somewhat more extravagant income." He bowed once more, with an almost ludicrous flourish, and left his bemused companion to pay the tab. Swirling a mouthful of tea around his tongue, Jace lifted the coin purse, let it sit in the palm of his hand. Half? He was going to have to find another patron, and none too swiftly. He'd always been careful about how much he demanded, how heavily he wielded the secrets that he found so easy to acquire, but he wondered now if perhaps he hadn't been too conservative with his latest mark. Grumbling to himself in a very unaristocratic manner, he turned his gaze once more to the river below. He always found it calming, but today it offered minimal comfort. Perhaps a surge of fear from the other customers of the cafe, a tide of emotion Jace could sense without effort, was his only warning. Instincts born partly of experience, and partly ingrained in his mind and soul as his birthright, had him toppling sideways in his chair and ducking under the heavy table before his conscious mind even identified the threat. A blast of searing fire roared from the heavens and sprayed across the stone under which he huddled. His lungs felt seared by the heated air, and he smelt the tips of his hair burning away. Still, the table was broad, and the air obscured with smoke. If his attacker hadn't seen him duck underneath, he might do well simply to wait, to remain hidden and allow the authorities to deal with whatever was going on. Dravik was, after all, wealthy enough to employ patrols of the Cloud-Winged Guard, an organization made up of a few surviving remnants of what had once been the Legion of Wojak, former keepers of Ravnica's law and order. They boasted a reputation for dealing with lawbreakers swiftly, efficiently, and permanently. Let them risk life and limb confronting whatever had hurled fire at him. Between the crackling of nearby potted plants that had ignited in the conflagration, and the pounding feet and panicked screams of the fleeing bystanders, Jace heard something new. The sound of claws clacking across the tabletop above him. Something had ridden the fire to earth. Muttering a handful of curses, he tensed. The Cloud-Winged Guard's numbers were few, and the districts they patrolled quite large. If something was hunting him in the plaza, waiting for their unpredictable response was no longer an option. Glancing over his shoulder, he measured the distance to the nearest exit, wanting desperately to run. He might make it, but without knowing what was clawing its way across the table, or how far it might chase him, he certainly wouldn't have bet what little money he had left on his chances. A quartet of Jaces lunged from beneath the table, each sprinting in a different direction to take cover beneath or behind some other flame-resistant obstruction. This one a pillar, that one another table. The thing that had skittered across the stone watched all four. Its ears lay back in confusion, and it stretched its mouth wide to utter an angry hiss that was the crackle of a dozen bonfires. It might have been a cat, this thing, had it not been roughly the size of a hunting dog, and had it not been made entirely of living, semi-solid flame. Moving in concert, all four images of Jace leaned out from cover. From their outstretched hands, a thick spray of freezing water arced across the open-air cafe to drench the fiery predator. A geyser of steam shot into the air, and the hiss of water on fire almost drowned out the terrified shriek of the elemental. Then the images, the water, even the steam were gone. The feline creature stood, utterly confused, its animalistic mind unable to grasp the concept of illusion. And Jace, the real Jace, who had been none of the four phantoms but wrapped tight in an illusion of invisibility, rose up before the distracted, disoriented beast, hauled back a fist, and struck. No mere punch, this, but a devastating blow of mystical force. Telekinesis had never been among Jace's stronger skills. The lifting of a simple fork or the opening of a distant window took everything he had, but manipulation of himself, that came far more easily. More than easily enough, with a few seconds of preparation and a surge of mana, to augment the strength of his own arms, to reach out and violently flip the table. The flaming beast flew from the tabletop to sail dozens of feet through the air, clean over the protective wall that marked the edge of the terrace, plummeting from sight. Jace didn't know how many levels of Dravik it might have dropped, or whether the fall would be sufficient to kill it, but he knew he intended to be well gone before it could return. For an instant, Jace cast his senses outward, peering behind walls, around corners, over ledges, but his cursory examination failed to locate the wizard who had summoned the beast, and he wasn't about to hang around for a prolonged search. The singed hem of his cloak swirling dramatically, Jace moved at a brisk walk toward the cafe's exit, trying hard to peer around him in every direction at once, and wondering just who he'd managed to piss off this time. 2 levels above, near the very peak of the mountain, a man stood within the high, arched confines of a tower window. He stared down, not with the naked eye, but through a peculiar crystalline device, globes within globes. Within its confines, he watched the events of the cafe unfold, lowering the sphere only when Jace Beleren swept from the open patio and into the bustling avenues. And still he waited, until he was joined several moments later by a woman, taller than he, broader of shoulder, with a shock of ash-gray hair that made her appear far older than her years. "Not a bad performance," he said to her without preamble. "He survived your fire cat easily enough, my dear." "Bah," she shrugged, leaning against the side of the massive window frame. "I'm not impressed. Decent reaction time, and I won't deny he's got power, but we've rejected recruits who performed a lot better." "We have. But then, we're not after Jace Beleren for his reaction time or even his illusions, are we? We'll see how he performs for Gemrith, and then we'll decide if we can make Jace Beleren who and what we need him to be." To Jace's paranoid and worry-addled mind, every insect flitting in the darkness was the eye of an enemy. Every echo, the footsteps of an unseen stalker creeping across the cobblestones. Every stranger, an assassin sent to grab him from behind. Every overhanging banner, a noose that hungered for his neck. He trod the roads, the alleys, and the broad steps of the descending avenues as swiftly as he dared, jumping at every sound, peering suspiciously at every shadow, until he finally reached his destination. What Jace called home was a modest 3-room flat, located in one of Dravic's lowest tiers, where the scents of the river filled the humid air with a vaguely fishy aroma, and the cost of living was only moderately outrageous. It was cheaper than anywhere else in the extravagant quarter, yes, but its proximity to the shore and the tiny islands beyond filled Jace with a sense of security. Jace had never understood, and none of his teachers had satisfactorily explained why the magics of the mind were best and most efficiently empowered by the mana that drifted and flowed within the waters of the many worlds. He knew only that it was so. With a sigh of profound relief, Jace slammed his door behind him, leaning briefly against it and trying to calm himself. That he'd made many enemies throughout the past few years was no surprise at all, considering how he supported his preferred lifestyle. That any of them could have found him so exposed, however, was worrisome in the extreme. He turned, locking the door's 4 deadbolts. Without lighting a lantern, he tossed his cloak haphazardly over an old coat rack, stepped into the next room, and collapsed into bed without bothering to get undressed. He'd deal with the rumples and wrinkles in the morning. Right now, he just needed time to relax, to meditate on the mana flowing through the currents beyond the shore. Despite his nervous energy, he was asleep within minutes, wrapped in peculiar and disturbing dreams wherein he tried to bribe a giant cat not to spit fire at him, only to find he couldn't afford the beast's asking price. He ran from the predator, calling for help as embers rained from the sky. And then he was awake, screaming at the terrible pain that throbbed in his chest. Craning his head until his neck ached, Jace stared at the horrid shape squatting atop his torso. Only scarcely visible in the dark of the chamber, it stood on 4 legs that jutted obscenely from its sides like those of an insect. 2 more appendages emerged from its shoulders to clutch at his collar. Its head was that of a jolly, almost cherubic old man, which stood in stark contrast to the wicked stinger at its tail, dripping with Jace's own blood. What? Jace froze in mid-question, his jaw clenching tight as his body spasmed with a new surge of pain. What do... He couldn't seem to force out the question. "You tell me, mind reader," the demon hissed in a voice that quivered with palsy. I can't." He could barely concentrate enough to speak, let alone read its mind. "You will. Tell me why I am here, Jace Beleren, and what I wish from you, and I will provide respite from this pain. Fail, and the poison shall run its course." Jace scarcely even reacted to the use of his name, though he'd never done business in Dravik as anyone but Barum, and never revealed the name Jace to anyone since he'd arrived on the sprawling, urban world of Ravnica. He struggled to rise, to throw the terrible thing away from him, but the last of his strength was drowning swiftly beneath the toxin's spreading burn. He wanted to cry out, to scream, to rail against the unfairness of it all, but he did none of these. Squeezing shut his eyes, clenching his jaw until his teeth ached, he forced himself to calm. Long moments passed, and the pain grew steadily worse, but Jace remained focused and stared down at the creature once more. Scarcely visible, even in the darkened room, his eyes began to glow. "Your master, your summoner, is a mage called Gemrith," he told the demon through trembling lips. "You were told that his master, called Tezzeret, wants to meet me, the first vineyard, an hour after dusk tomorrow." Even through the pain, Jace felt his anger growing, burning away the worst of his weakness. "This was a test," he accused his vile attacker. "A test indeed, Jace Beleren, and one you have passed." The horrific vermin skittered off him and made for the window. "Antidote," he croaked, his throat dry with agony. Somehow, the inhuman creature shrugged. "Poison's not lethal," it cackled at him as it scurried over the sill. "You'll be fine in an hour or 2. Jace watched it go, the rage and humiliation burning within him as fiercely as the poison itself. He fell back on his mattress, struggled to find his center, to focus on the rushing, mana-rich waters, and then, through his pain, through his confusion, through his lingering fear, he began to cast a spell far simpler than mind-reading. He waited nearby, this mage called Gemrith, sitting beside a fruit vendor's stand and crunching contently on a honey apple. His salt and pepper beard was thick and bushy, rather than neatly trimmed, but otherwise he appeared every inch the rich and stylish citizen of Dravik, draped in multiple layers of tunics and coats of rich crimson and black. And he smiled, taking a last bite of the candied fruit as his pet came scurrying around the corner, clinging to the walls and windowsills. For a few moments they conversed, the minuscule demon hanging just above the wizard's shoulder. Only then, with an upraised hand, did Gemrith dismiss the abomination back whence it came. Picking a bit of peel from between his teeth, he strode away, merging with the nighttime traffic. Above him, all but invisible in the darkened sky, its dragonfly wings fluttering in unnatural silence, a tiny insect-winged cloud sprite followed in his wake. Not all the wealthy neighborhoods of Ravnica were quite so dramatic as Dravik, of course. That particular district might cling to a mountainside like a tired explorer, but much of Ravnica was covered not in great peaks, shining lakes, or thick swamps, but gently rolling plains. In the center of one of the largest was the district Ovitsia, and in the center of Ovitsia stood a number of manors, among the largest that Ravnica had to offer. And it was to one of these, up the gleaming steps from the curb, across the broad marble porch to the front door, that Jace's steps carried him early the next day. The woman who opened the door in response to his tug upon the bell was clearly no servant. She wore a gown of the finest white gossamer over a snug slip of woven gold, a perfect match for the waist-length hair swept back behind her pointed ears. Her reed-slender figure could most generously be described as boyish, but her features were soft and elegant, and she moved with what Jace could only think a purely feminine grace. "Barim," she greeted him warmly, with an affectionate, if shallow embrace, a purely chaste kiss upon his right cheek. "Hello, Amara," Jace smiled broadly in turn. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced like this." "Oh, don't be stupid," she told him. "You know I don't. What brings you to Ovitsia?" "Nothing in particular," Jace hedged. "Just fluttering around the city, and realized I wasn't accomplishing anything, so I figured I'd visit a friend." "Well, of course you weren't. Isn't it you humans who always say, 'Fluttery will get you nowhere'?" Jace blinked, replaying the sentence to be sure he heard what he thought he had. "Funny," he finally deadpanned. "How long have you been saving that one?" "Oh, years at least," Amara replied cheerfully. "Elves have that kind of time, you know." Both broke into large grins then, and she stepped back, allowing her visitor to pass through the doorway and into her home. Home indeed. Private indoor villa was more accurate. Amara Tandris was the first mage Jace had met in Ravnica, and still one of the most confusing. Rumor had it she was once a member in good standing of the Selesnya Conclave, but if so, her own fortunes clearly hadn't faded with the influence of the guilds. In public, she made little, if any, show of her powers, but in private, just about everything with her was magic, even when it would have been just as simple, or even more so, by mundane efforts. No living servants occupied her vast manor. Instead, various constructs, some of white marble, some of stuffing and woven fabric in the form of various humanoids and woodland animals, fetched and cleaned and gathered at her need. Most were tiny, barely able to carry a platter full of food, though a few were as large as the elf herself. Animating these dolls was only one of her many hobbies, and in fact, Amara had been known to take commissions for these mindless servants as a means of bolstering her income. Even stranger, the manor boasted no internal walls, no doors, no stairs. A vast array of marble columns, carved to resemble the bark of trees, stood at intervals throughout the domicile. They supported the weight of the floors above, but did little to separate one chamber from another. In fact, chambers pretty much began and ended where Amara said they did. If one required privacy, one simply adjourned to a different story, and that too involved the many pillars. For while each seemed solid enough, if one chose to, one could physically step inside, a feeling that Jace could only liken to walking through a wall of the fatty accumulation scraped from the top of a pot of heavy stew, and emerge from any of the other pillars, anywhere in the manor. It was, all things considered, a bizarre way to live, and far more space than any one human could ever have needed. But Jace had long since given up trying to understand the mindset of elves in general, and Amara was stranger than most. For an hour or so, they sat at her dining table and talked about the current state of affairs, which districts were struggling to survive since the guilds disintegrated, which were thriving, which were ripped by political or criminal warfare. The little constructs scuttled about, appearing from various pillars with carafes of juices, nectars, and fruit teas, and plates of elven pastries that liquefied in the mouth, requiring no chewing at all. Finally, when the glasses stood mostly empty, the plate of sweets far lighter than it had been, Amara's eyes turned serious and flickered first to the vague singeing on Jace's face, which he had thought was light enough to go unnoticed, and then to the stinging scab on his chest, which should have been hidden by his tunic and vest. "I can take care of those, if you'd like," she offered. Jace smiled, but shook his head. "They're really pretty minor. Don't hurt much at all anymore." "So, are you going to tell me why you're really here, Baron? I adore your company, and you know you're always welcome, but it's a pretty long walk to take by accident." Jace lifted the last of his drink, sloshed it around in his glass, and replaced it untouched. "What do you know about a man called Tezzeret?" he asked finally. The elf raised an eyebrow. "I know that if you got those wounds tussling with him or his people, you haven't run nearly far enough." "Well, yes and no, then." "Tezzeret?" he prompted again. Amara shook her head. "Have you heard of an organization called the Infinite Consortium?" "I think I've heard the name." "Before the guilds fell, it was just another mercantile organization. But now I wouldn't be surprised, someday, to see it become a political body. The Consortium, in brief, is one of those we'll find anything and sell it to anybody for the right price operations. I'm sure they deal in contraband at least as often as legal goods, but nobody could prove it before, and there's nobody left to prove it now." "I see," Jace muttered, leaning back and wondering what they wanted with him. "The thing is," Amara cautioned, "they really do seem able to get anything. Or at least so I've heard in some of the more esoteric circles I frequent, including objects and creatures of pretty potent mystical power, and things that don't seem to come from anywhere I've ever heard of. Jace straightened, his brow furrowed. He'd never quite figured out if Amara knew of the existence of other worlds, of planeswalkers and the blind eternities. Most folk, even most wizards, did not. Regardless, reading between the lines, Jace had a whole new understanding why they called themselves the Infinite Consortium. And Tezzeret, he pressed, he's their leader? She nodded. Not their first, as I understand it, but certainly he's in charge now. He's a mage, Barum, a potent one, and word is he's not the only one in the group either. I've never heard of them hurting people without cause, but they'd definitely make unpleasant enemies. What's your interest in them exactly? Jace offered a smile that was meant to be reassuring, but instead implied that something wasn't sitting still in his stomach. They want to meet with me, and their invitation was, fairly insistent, not to mention impolite. Amara frowned, and she leaned forward intently, placing one slender hand atop Jace's own. Do you want me to come with you? Jace had to swallow a lump in his throat, truly moved by the elf's offer. Smiling a genuine smile now, he took her hand in his. Thank you, he said, and meant those words more than he had in a very long time. But no, I won't ask you to put yourself in that sort of danger. Besides, if they wanted me dead, they had plenty of opportunity when they delivered their invitation. It was all very chivalric, quite noble, and utterly full of crap. If Jace thought for one moment that Amara's presence would mean the difference between life and death, he'd have accepted without thinking twice. But Tezzeret's emissary had said nothing about inviting a third party, and Jace felt, given the sort of violence they were capable of just as a test, that offending them by bringing backup was probably the more dangerous option. He spent another hour in the Elven Wizard's company, learning a bit more about the Infinite Consortium, and then, as the conversation meandered in that way that even the most serious conversations do, about the nature of those elven pastries, the difficulty in getting certain fruits, and just how badly the unseasonably hot summer had damaged the crop. The sun slowly dropped below the district's tallest buildings, sending fingers of shadow reaching out to take the entire neighborhood in their grasp, and Jace knew he'd better be moving on. Thanking Amara once more, he took a moment to steady his nerves, and stepped out onto the street. His instincts still screamed at him to run, to avoid this meeting like a plague rat, but Jace wasn't quite prepared to give up life in Dravik, and if he was going to stay, he couldn't afford to make Tezzeret an enemy. Besides, he really wanted to know how they knew who he was, what he could do, when nobody else on Ravnica did. But that didn't mean he had to play the game they dealt him. Not when he could take a peek at their hand. Jace concentrated briefly as he wandered down the streets of Avitsia and waited for his summoned fairy spy to respond. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please consider leaving a like or sharing this video with your friends. If you subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell, you'll be alerted whenever I upload new videos. If you have a topic you'd like me to discuss, feel free to let me know in the comments section below. Finally, if you'd like to support me directly, well, I've created a Patreon for this channel. If you like what I do and want to help me out, go check it out. A link to it will be in the description below. Thanks again, and have a great day.